Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to my intonation mini activity. As we've seen this week, intonation affects all aspects of spoken language. It gives language flavor and can convey as much, if not more, meaning than the language itself. For this activity, I focused on intonation patterns related to questions as discussed in lecture and in chapter 11 of our book. There's an important rationale for an activity that practices question intonation patterns. Practicing different intonation patterns for questions in English is important because different intonation patterns can change the meaning of a question. For example, rising intonation at the end of a question typically signals a yes or no question, while falling intonation can indicate a question that seeks more detailed information. Additionally, changing the pitch and stress of certain words within a question can convey different shades of meaning, such as surprise, skepticism, or urgency. By practicing different intonation patterns for questions, learners can become more aware of the nuances of English intonation and develop the ability to use it effectively in their own speech. My intended learners for this activity are adult L1 Spanish speakers in a Spanish-speaking country who have an advanced English proficiency level. I've spent most of my life studying Spanish, so I'm always fascinated in differences between Spanish and English, and intonation is no exception. Intonation patterns between English and Spanish, including question formation, are different. For example, in yes or no questions, Spanish uses a falling rising intonation, whereas English has a very pronounced rising intonation. Distinction is not that different, but you can hear it. So like in this example, in English, you would say, do you want a coffee? And there's a real strong rising intonation there. Whereas in Spanish, it would drop a bit and then rise at the end, where you would say, ¿Quieres un café? So do you want a coffee? ¿Quieres un café? Not that different, but there is a distinction. So we learned that English has a wider pitch range than most languages. And I was trying to think about a way to introduce this concept of pitch in language. And then I thought about the song Limbo Rock, because it's got this, wide pitch between higher pitch and lower pitch. And I thought it'd make a good idea for a warm-up activity. So what I would do is I would play the song Limbo Rock, and I would use my hands to demonstrate the varying pitch. So for the higher pitch, I'd move my hands up in the air, and then for the lower pitch, I'd move my hands down towards the ground, demonstrating this rhythm of high and low pitch. And eventually I encourage the learners to join in, and I could even lead them in a game of limbo as an icebreaker. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this so you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. Probably all recognize this song. So for the up pitch, here I go, up with the hand and down. The hands go back, up, and then down, back up, and back down. So the warm-up activity should lead to a nice segue into talking about pitches relating to question formation. So I begin by explaining the different types of questions in English, including yes/no questions, WH questions, both types of tag questions, questions with or, and questions that are derived from statements that seek information and can express a range of meanings, such as surprise, disbelief, anger, happiness, etc. So here you see those 5 different types of questions. So yes, no. Are you going to the store? Yes, I am. No, I'm not. WH question, what is your name? Tag question, you're going to the store, aren't you? Meaning I'm asking for information. Or you're going to the store, aren't you? Meaning I'm just confirming something I already know. Questions with or, do you want ice cream or cake? And statements that are made into a question, like you're going to the store, if I'm maybe expressing some surprise, or you're going to the store, maybe some, disdain. So those kinds of ideas. The next part of the pre-activity is to create a 5-column chart on a whiteboard or something similar, 1 column for each of the 5 kinds of questions. I would write a question in each column relating to the same topic, changing the language to fit each type of question. I would then model the intonation pattern for each question. So like for the first example here, yes or no, is it going to rain today? WH, when is it going to rain? Tag question, it's going to rain, isn't it? Or it's going to rain, isn't it? Or question, is it going to rain or snow? Other questions, it's going to rain today? After a few examples like this, I would then write questions in each column. I would read the questions out loud without any intonation. I would then ask the learners to decide what intonation pattern best fits the question. So now we're up to the activity, which I've called Pitch Perfect Questions. So for this activity, the learners are going to create their own questions and assign the appropriate intonation to them. So I'll divide the learners into pairs or small groups, and each group will be given keywords on an index card. Each group will create different kinds of questions using their keywords, and the chart that we created earlier is a visual aid. Each group will present their questions to the entire class, adding the appropriate intonation patterns. I'll record the presentations and play them back. I'll ask the learners to identify the type of question being used and the intonation pattern being used, and provide feedback as necessary. I would then recirculate the index cards and repeat the activity. So as an example, I might put on an index card, John bought car, and then those students would create 5 questions, one for each column, using those words like, did John buy a car? When did John buy a car? John bought a car, didn't he? Did John buy a car or a bicycle? Or John bought a car? So at this stage, the learners will have deduced that intonation patterns convey as much, if not more, meaning than the words that make up the question itself. So for a post activity, I would lead the learners in a discussion to reinforce the importance of intonation and communication. I might ask them questions like, how did practicing different intonation patterns affect your understanding of the question? Can you think of a situation where using the wrong intonation pattern could have negative consequences, like at a job interview, for example? Or how can we practice improving intonation skills outside of class? I'd encourage the learners to watch videos, movies, and TV shows, etc., to reinforce and practice what they have learned. So this activity, as I said, was focused on question intonation patterns, but there are all kinds of ways a teacher can modify the activity. For example, a teacher could use more complex questions and intonation patterns. A teacher could include rhetorical questions, that is, questions that don't call for an answer, like, why don't you stay for dinner? Or why don't we see a movie? Teacher can delve deeper into different intonations used to convey emotions, or can broaden a lesson to encompass statements, commands, or requests. Or the teacher can create separate activities to address the different facets of intonation. The sky is really the limit. Thank you for listening to my presentation.